What they wanted to do was to strip the music down to its essence and create something that they called pure rock and roll.
What do they know? Your face is sweaty and your eyes are red. The face of mine is steady and your head. Roll yourself another stick of grass. Jump on the seat beside and move your ass.
Howdy film fans, this is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter and this is another episode in my ongoing series on punk cinema. Throughout the series, and most particularly I guess in the last episode on the film The Living End, we've been talking a little bit about whether or not a film that's not ostensibly about punk music, punk fans, punkers, can be considered punk cinema. And I feel like in this journey, we've come to some definitions of punk aesthetic, punk attitude, anti-authoritarianism, things like that, that I say I at least agree can imbue films, imbue certain cinema with a punk attitude. In this video, I would like to consider the opposite, the converse, or the contrapositive. Mathematicians, let me know. Logicians. Can a film that's about punk, very specifically about punk, sells itself as being about punk, not be punk cinema? That's one of the many questions I want to consider as we talk about this intriguing and I would say important film, A Band Called Death, in this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Hey everybody, thanks for your patience. I know it's been a while since I put a video up. This semester of teaching for me was pretty intense in a good way. Had a lot of good classes, great students, but there's been a lot of planning, marking, and all that sort of stuff that goes along with being a university lecturer. I'm hoping over the next few weeks, I'm definitely going to wrap up the punk cinema series. I've only got one more video to do in that, and then maybe to work my way through late December and early January through the Mumblecore series that I talked about way back in, I don't know, late spring, early summer. So that's kind of what the winter looks like. The other thing to keep your eyes out for is later this week on Friday or Saturday, I'm going to do one of my rare live streams and I'll be posting information in the community section. So keep an eye on that. If you're not already subscribed to the page and you want to find out more about that live stream coming up, make sure you just hit subscribe and hit the notification bell and then you'll know for sure. But let's get into the movie. A Band Called Death is a 2012 documentary film, and it's a fascinating film. And the story that it recounts it's incredible and really worth knowing for fans of punk music, but also kind of garage music, Detroit music, and that city's fascinating sort of multivalent musical history and important contributions to American music in all kinds of ways. And they come into this story in several interesting ways too. It was directed by Mark Christopher Corvino and Jeff Howlett, and they had known some of the surviving members of the band for quite a while, although for a long time in their friendship or in their sort of acquaintanceship, they didn't know that these guys had been members of A Band Called Death until an interesting string of events happened in the early 2000s that the film recounts kind of in its second half. And I'm going to talk all about that. But first, I just want to tell you briefly, if you don't know, Death was a band that was formed in the early 1970s in Detroit by three brothers, the Hackney brothers. David, who played guitar and wrote most of the songs. Bobby, who's now called Bobby Sr. because he has a son. Bobby, who played bass and sang most of the songs, or sang lead vocals anyway. And Dennis, who played drums. And they were from an African-American family in Detroit whose father was a kind of part-time minister. There's different accounts. In the film, they describe him as a minister. They had other siblings, and they grew up in the Detroit of the 1960s, which, if you've seen like Michael Moore films, if you've seen the Catherine Bigelow film Detroit, which is kind of the end of this era, was a city that had once thrived and was kind of in decline. And that affected its music industry in a lot of ways. And the film opens with a lot of, it's kind of a montage of dereliction, Detroit dereliction. And 8 Mile, the Eminem film's another depiction of this you might have seen. Just kind of abandoned homes, overgrown yards, burnt out houses, these kind of things that I think have popularly become associated with the Detroit cityscape, or at least parts of Detroit, neighborhoods of Detroit. They often stand in for all of Detroit. And I've never been to Detroit. I have driven around Detroit from Canada to Ohio and into Illinois on a few occasions, but I've never actually gone into the city, and I would like to. It just road tripping, and it wasn't on the itinerary, all that sort of stuff. So I can't speak to, I would love if there's anyone from Detroit who's living in Detroit now to comment on this, but I always feel like when you see a city's depiction on screen and you're seeing it depicted in the same ways kind of over and over and over again, that this is a trope or a metaphor for that city that's probably really a neighborhood or 2 or 3 different neighborhoods. I lived in Belfast in Northern Ireland for a long time, and the Belfast you see on film is real, but it's part of Belfast. And when you go to Belfast, you're like, oh, wow, there's all this beautiful nature around it. There's these amazing buildings. The city center is gorgeous. There's all kinds of vibrant social life, cultural life. You're like, this isn't the Belfast from the movies. And I feel like that might be true of Detroit as well. Anyway, in the late 60s, when these boys were growing up, into the 70s, it was changing rapidly. There was a lot of sort of flight from the city in terms of people with money. There was a lot of the abandonment of social networks, social structures. And of course, there were the Detroit City riots at the end of the 60s where the National Guard came in and people were killed. And these were riots predominantly by African-American residents of the city who were protesting over their treatment by the police. You know, some things never change, unfortunately. And this is the backdrop that these boys grew up in, but it was also the Detroit of Motown, which they talk about a lot. It was a Detroit of music. It's a music city, and it has been for a century. You know, Detroit is one of the key music cities in America. It's also one of the key punk cities in America. You can't talk about American punk music without talking about, at the very least, the Stooges and the MC5. These are bands from the late 60s. They're considered kind of proto-punk, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But anyone who was a punker in the 70s, from the Ramones to the Sex Pistols to the Clash to anyone else, knew about the Stooges, knew about Iggy Pop, and knew about the MC5. So Detroit it's fascinating that this story happens in Detroit, or starts in Detroit, because it fits into the fabric, I think, the story of a city that everybody kind of knows is important, but sort of forgets about when we're talking about American popular music. And we, think about New York, Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, Atlanta. man, Detroit. Madonna's from Detroit. Eminem's from Detroit. Alice Cooper's from Detroit. Also figures into this story. And so much more, you know, techno's starting in Detroit and so on. So these brothers grow up, and like so many musicians from the late 60s and the 70s.
I mean, it was my dad who sat us down and made us watch the Beatles.
When the minute I saw Paul McCartney singing and playing that Beatle bass, you know, I wanted to play bass and still wanted to sing. And David tuned into John Lennon playing the guitar, and it was David who rallied us to, you know, be a band and get together, and that made him the leader.
And they spend the 60s kind of honing their craft, getting better at their instruments, and, you know, getting better at playing with each other. And this is one thing I kind of wish the film had gone into more, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And they're playing a kind of funk soul band, and there's some early discussion in the film about how this was kind of expected. Like, somebody says at one point, if you were black in Detroit, you played Motown music. And so that's kind of what they were doing until two momentous events that happened near each other, which was David, the guitar playing brother, saw the band The Who in concert, and he came back to his brothers and said, we have to play rock and roll. That's it. He had that kind of, you know, come to the mountain moment where whatever they were doing wasn't enough, and he felt it. And then he saw Alice Cooper, son of Detroit, or Sons of Detroit at the time, when Alice Cooper was actually the name of the band. Anyway, and they decide that they're going to start playing rock and roll. And what they really wanted to do, what David became obsessed with, and David is kind of like the mad genius in Death, or at least that's how the film depicts him, is to distill rock down. He loved The Who and the power of The Who, the grandiosity of The Who, but what he really seemed to have taken away from it is that sort of the short, sharp, stabbing energy of some of The Who's music, especially kind of when they're transitioning, this is my guess, but when they're transitioning from, you know, the mod Who to the sort of bigger rock opera Who. And then Alice Cooper, you know, and if it's hard for you today to look at Alice Cooper, and if you haven't like experienced much of his music, go back and listen to some of those early 70s albums. In particular, something like Love It to Death, which has the song I'm 18 on it, which is not punk. It's not even really kind of proto-punk like the Stooges and MC5 were, but it just has this like dark, ragged energy, and it's really good. And I would say 18 is kind of proto-punk. What do you think? And so David anyway heard this music and he got switched on to it, and he wanted to make, this pure rock and roll, what he called it. And this is what the band began working on. And around this time, in 1974, their father died in a car accident. And David, these were religious boys. They weren't, like, from what I can tell, hardcore religious, but they were raised in the church. They were raised with a pastor for a father. They know some scripture. And David, being the sort of imaginative kind of genius might be too strong a word, but certainly the sort of more artistically inclined of the band, and they're all great musicians, so I'm not talking about that, but just in terms of his vision for what a band could be, their father's death really affected him, and out of that came his desire to name the band Death. And the other two brothers talk about how they weren't really sure about this, and one of them says,
"This is the name, dude. Death."
Death. Oh, man.
So me and Bobby just kind of looked at each other as if to say, this dude's gone way off the deep end.
That's not something new, this idea of taking death and put a positive spin on it. In fact, it's very Christian in a lot of ways, right? But at the time, even with the sort of radical things that were going on in rock music in the late 60s and early 70s, apparently that was a stretch for a lot of people to have a band called Death. Like, you gotta change your name. But that would come later. So they start, practicing writing music and just honing this pure rock sounds. A little bit like this.
Number one biggest game is when they gain number fame. Like a race at the top because they wanna be boss. They don't care who they step on as long as they get along. Politicians in my eyes.
That was recorded in 1974. And the thing about the band is they made basically one recording. They got some studio time at a small studio in Detroit, and they went in and they recorded what I think today would... It's shorter than a typical LP, but it's longer than an EP, 7 or 8 tracks. And it sounds great. It's a very good recording and a very good distillation of, pure rock. And there's some psychedelic stuff. Punk hasn't happened as punk. So the definition of punk, which I'll come back to in a moment, hasn't kind of, even in its early days, started to sort of ossify or solidify. Or if it had in the clubs and CBGBs, these guys in Detroit didn't have a clue that this was going on. So there's some psychedelia, there's some jamming, there's some like good classic rock vibes, but most of it is this sort of, and this snarling singing, and it's awesome, and you should listen to it. But they couldn't get a record deal. They came close. They were in talks with Clive Davis, and everyone they talked to, including Davis, said, hey man, you guys sound great. You got to change the name. And Bobby and Dennis talk about in the film how, well, listen.
David, in no uncertain terms, just said, tell Clive Davis to go to hell.
Okay, so David, our illustrious leader, turned the deal down. When that came out of David's mouth, me and Bob had nothing coming out of ours. We were flabbergasted, even though we didn't agree with it in public. Back up your brother. But in private, we had a bitter argument about that. Listen, man, these guys want to give us $20,000 contract in the 70s. That's a pretty big contract. We could have actually just went ahead and changed the name. I mean, how many times are we going to get a contract like this? And, then Dave got mad at us.
If we give them the title to our band, Dave said you might as well give them everything else.
I love that. I love the idea outside of my thinking about punk and film, just in sort of, history, esoterica, magic, all kinds of things, that there's power in a name. And this name came to David in the wake of his father's death, combined with these kind of mystical religious ideas that he was forming about the afterlife, about life outside of Earth, about what it means to live. And it was a very sort of, to him, like integral part of the band. And when he says, if they take our name, they're going to take everything else, that to me is just such sound reasoning. To the brothers, it wasn't. And to the detriment of the band, it meant, at least again, as it's framed in this film, no dice, dudes. Change the name or no. And they didn't change the name. So they never released the album. They did release a single, very limited pressing. They couldn't sell them all. They released it themselves, and they would sell them at gigs. They didn't play a lot of gigs. They didn't have a big following. They weren't like the local band that everyone had to see. And so they basically fizzled out, and the rest of their story is very short. Strange, but short, in that they decided to move to Vermont. And they knew that in Burlington, and there's a lot of reasons why they went, but in Burlington there was the big University of Vermont, it's a university town, there'll be a built-in audience, and they went up there, the whole band, and they tried to get a thing going on as Death, and they played some gigs, and it didn't work out. Again, as it's framed in the film, they couldn't garner a following because of their name. People just weren't into going to see a band called Death. And so David, who met a woman in Burlington who he fell in love with and he would marry and stay with until he passed away, moved back to Detroit. And Bobby and Dana stayed in Burlington, where they still live, and they've made something of a living as practicing musicians. They talk a little bit in the film about their other day jobs, but they started a reggae band called, The Lamb's Breath, and they seem to, from what I can tell by what the film says, by videos on YouTube, by reading about them, they seem to have carved out a decent jobbing musician life, playing college gigs, playing festival circuits, and things like that. And David went home and apparently kept writing music, and he did record a little more music, which the film plays, got his brothers to play on some of it, but also sadly descended into some serious alcoholism, and he was a lifelong smoker. And he passed away in 2000 from lung cancer. And kind of for all intents and purposes, that's the end of Death. Until the 2000s, when internet culture was starting to connect people in all kinds of ways. And some of the people that it started to connect was punkers and record collectors, weird record collectors. And this rock and roll victim single started popping up on sort of prized record collecting lists. And some punkers started to realize that they had it. And the film goes into this in more detail, but they start talking to each other online and they start to sort of investigate who is this band. And meanwhile, Bobby, the bass player and singer, has a few teenage children, and one of them is out in California, and he's at a party, and this song comes on that he's never heard before, and he's like, man, this sounds really familiar. What is this? And he finds out it's his dad singing. He calls his dad, and he's like, have you ever heard of this band Death? And his dad's like, yeah, that's the band I was in with your uncles. And all of this stuff, this is kind of an exciting part of the film, so I won't sort of spoil it all, leads to the band's rediscovery. And what the documentary is really about is the rediscovery of the band and eventually the release of their album for the whole world to see, which is awesome, and you should listen to it. It's a fascinating story, and the last sort of 15 or 20 minutes is about the band getting back together. They have a friend who steps in on guitar, they go on tour. Bobby's son's band opens for them, they play Death songs, and people get into this band that was forgotten about. And they start being framed as the first punk band. Pre-punk, punk before punk. They recorded this album in 75, so it is before the Ramones and Blondie and all of that sort of stuff, but after the Stooges and the MC5. So it's part of a kind of development of punk. But it leads me to think about, first of all, this question of what is punk, which has come up throughout this series. And one of the things I think it's easy to say you can't define punk because as soon as you put a definition on it, it becomes unpunk, which is cool and a very punk attitude. But also, there was no punk music in the Victorian era. People might have done things and believed things, anarchists and sort of the early suffragettes and kind of anti-slavery people that today might appear punk, but they didn't have that combination of fashion, of outsider, anti-establishment attitude, and the music, which is an important part of it, all combined. So Death has some of that. There's an element of anti-establishment to them, a strong one, and the whole, we're not going to change our name for you, the man, is very punk. Does it matter if they were punk before the Ramones? Can we chart the beginning of punk with Death? I mean, it doesn't necessarily matter to me, but I think in a lot of ways that's a rhetorical way of pushing the band's story, which is fine. I hope they get more exposure because they're awesome. But it leads me to another question that I think is quite interesting and that ties back into some of the stuff we've talked about, especially with the Decline of Western Civilization movie, which is, what was the scene? And it doesn't seem like there was a scene around Death. And this is something I wish the film had gone into more in any way that it could. It's got some archival stuff. It's got some sounds of them recording. It's got some pictures of them playing. And I can understand that not everyone was, the Sex Pistols with Julian Temple following around with a camera all the time. But there's very little about like the making of the music, aside from a short bit on when they recorded it, but like, how did they write? How did they jam? There's a little bit about playing in the bedroom. But where did they play? Who liked them? They didn't round up any old fans of Death, or I remember seeing them, and so on. So there really is a sense, and I might be wrong about this, but this comes out of the film. There's a sense that they were just their own project, and that there was no scene around them. And then because they disappeared, because they were too good, or because they were ahead of their time, sure, but because they kind of disappeared, they didn't influence anybody. So when we look at like the Stooges and say, yeah, they're not really punk, but they're proto-punk, they're pre-punk, they influenced all of punk, MC5, even like the Kinks, all those garage bands that you can get on the Nuggets collection that punkers were listening to and going, oh, we can do this, You don't have that with Death. That doesn't mean their sound isn't punk, and that doesn't mean that they're not awesome, and it doesn't mean they won't influence bands in the future, which I hope they do, because I love their audaciousness. I love their mix of like what we would call punk with kind of classic rock. They jam with their really sort of trenchant political but also trippy lyrics all mixed together. They're so cool. But where do they fit if we're putting together a history of punk, let's say, which a lot of people have done, and you can go find them everywhere. Where do they fit on that? They're an outlier. Because maybe they were too punk. I don't know. Maybe they were too punk. And society wasn't ready for them, man. So they're this interesting, fascinating outlier that in a lot of ways were more punk than the actual punk scenes that were starting to form, mostly at that point in New York, and then soon after in Southern California, and of course in London and around the UK. And I have no answer to this. Like, to me, they're an awesome punk band, but this kind of step into the rhetoric of they were the first punk band, or that's fine. Describe them as you want. But even if you look at their videos on YouTube, underneath you get all these people saying, no, they weren't really punk. Yeah, they were. I don't care. And it's the YouTube version of that discourse. But it's kind of worth considering. And I came across a book recently. It's called Punk Rock and Philosophy, and it's edited by Joshua Heter, Heter, and Richard Green. And it's from a series of books on philosophy and pop culture. And I haven't read a lot of it. I only discovered it this week, but it's funny. I was putting this video together and I started looking through a couple of the chapters, and they touch on this question of what is punk a lot from a kind of philosophical point of view. And in the first chapter, The Essence of Punk by Timothy M., again, apologies, Kwiatek or Kwiatek. It's Kwiatek. He basically responds to what I just said, or rebukes what I just said, because he does talk about the politics of punk, and he talks about the scenes of punk, but he also talks about how punk has changed. So like in his earliest punk scenes, there was a lot of homophobia, which I've talked about quite a bit in this series. But in his most recent show that he went to, before writing this chapter, it was a pro-trans rights punk show. And so you can't just like pin punk down. He says as soon as you call punk political, you cut off other avenues of expression for punk. And I said way back in one of the first videos, it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. So maybe that's what we can use to describe death. You know, they don't fit many of the definitions of punk in the classic historical sense, but they're punk, man. Hardcore, thrashy, fun, angry, aggressive punk. Is it a punk film? I mean, as I've just talked about, trying to define punk can be a sort of endless rabbit hole of yeah buts and whatabouts and so on. But at the end of the day, I would say probably no. It's a good film to watch. I'm glad I watched it. I learned a lot, and like I said, I've been listening to the band all fall, which wouldn't have happened probably if I hadn't encountered the film. I'm really glad the band is getting the recognition that it deserves, and I hope more people listen to them and will be influenced by them, and so on. But as a film, it's a pretty kind of standard 20 teens Netflixy talking head doc. There's not much cinematically that's interesting about it at all, like from any vantage point. It's almost all people in a room talking, people on film, talking head shots. There's a little bit of archival footage, not as much as I would like, but that's kind of the vagaries of how these things go. Like I said, they didn't have their Julian Temple. And there's little in the way of like, I don't know, anything audacious or innovating about the film. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just doesn't mean it's great. I know this series is called What Makes This Film Great. What makes this film great is nothing to do with it as a film. There's nothing to do with it cinematically. It's just that it tells an important story. It tells it well. Some of the things could be told more clearly. I think all of the stuff about how the record was discovered and who was finding the record and selling it and who was getting it and how that led to the sons or the Bobby Sr.'s sons hearing it it's actually a little murky. And the story of them as an active band, like if people were listening, I said earlier that there was no scene, but actually the film doesn't go into that. That's missing, and I feel like those are two kind of big holes in the film. They don't rob it of its importance and they don't rob it of its excitement, but just, in terms of filmmaking, basic narrative strategy, those are two important parts of the story that could have been told better, I think. I wouldn't say there's much that's punk about it as a film, but it's enjoyable to watch. It's worth watching. If you like punk music, you should definitely watch it. If you like any kind of rock music, if you're interested in the story of Detroit, this is definitely a new story that fits with other ones, but is its own and is different and is worth knowing about. So for those reasons, I think it's a really important film. It's an enjoyable film to watch. You'll be glad that you watched it. I wouldn't call it a punk film, but it is an important film if you're into punk, if that makes sense. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter. Make sure you hit like, make sure you hit subscribe. If you want to know more about when my videos are coming out, and if you want to know more about the upcoming live stream, hit the notification bell. Also, please share this video with your friends. I'm still trying to grow the channel. The elusive 2,000 subscribers is right around the corner for me, which is small in the landscape of YouTube, but big for a dude who stands in his living room and does deep dives on obscure films. So let's try to hit 2K before the end of the new year. That would be awesome. I'll be back soon with one more punk film, another documentary. We'll see how punk that documentary is. It'll be interesting to compare. And until then, this is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter. Please keep watching movies.